He found her the way a man finds something the land has tried to hide. Elias Voss was 50 years old, heavy-set and slow-moving in the way of men who have learned that hurrying rarely changes anything. He had ridden out before sunrise to check the east fence line, the same stretch he checked every few weeks when the posts started leaning and the wire started singing in the wind. The night before, his horses had spooked badly, bunching together at the far end of the paddock and refusing to settle until well past midnight. He figured coyotes. Maybe a stray bull wandering down from the high pasture. Nothing that required much concern from a man who had seen most of what the Sulphur Springs Valley had to offer. The summer of 1884 had been punishing. The grass across that whole stretch of Arizona territory had bleached pale as old bone under a sun that showed no mercy and offered no apology. The earth had cracked open in long, jagged lines, like something beneath the ground was trying to get out. The Dragoon Mountains sat off to the west, purple and permanent, indifferent to the suffering of everything that lived in their shadow. Elias had worked this land for 11 years. He knew its moods the way a man knows the face of someone he has lived beside for a long time, without much tenderness left between them, but with a deep, unspoken understanding. The fence post was snapped clean, not leaning, not rusted through at the base the way posts usually failed. Snapped, like something heavy and desperate had hit it at speed. Elias stepped down from his horse and crouched to look, and that was when he started noticing the other things. A length of military bridle leather, caught on the thorns of a mesquite bush, the brass ring at its end still bright. Boot prints in the cracked clay, deep-heeled army issue, cutting across the softer dirt near the fence line. And beside them, smaller prints. Bare feet. A woman, by the size and stride. The tracks came from the east and stopped making sense about 40 yards into his pasture, where the boot prints circled twice and then turned back the way they came. His horses had not scattered the way they normally would after a nighttime scare. They were standing in a rough arc at the far side of the field, heads low, watching a patch of grass near the dry creek bed. Just standing. Not grazing, not drifting. Watching. Elias walked toward what they were watching. He did not know it yet, but the thing hidden in that grass would bring Fort Bowie to his door before noon and put a dead man's theft back into his hands before midnight. The grass was tall enough there to hide a dog. It would have hidden a young woman entirely if the toe of one bare foot had not been visible at the edge where the stalks grew thinner. He almost stepped on her before he saw the foot. He stopped. He looked. He went down on one knee in the dirt beside her. She was Apache, young, maybe 27, with dark hair matted against the side of her face. Her lips were cracked to bleeding from the heat. Her breathing came in shallow pulls, the kind a body makes when it has given most of what it had and is down to the reserves. There was a wound along her right side, wrapped in a torn piece of brown cloth that had soaked through dark. Someone had bandaged her quickly, the way you do it when you have no time and no supplies, and the only goal is to keep moving. The wound looked worse than it was, long and ugly along the ribs, but not deep enough to kill her if the heat did not finish the job first. Elias pulled the yellow bandana from around his neck, folded it twice, and pressed it gently against the wound. He reached behind him for the old blanket he kept rolled behind his saddle and laid it over her to cut the sun. He leaned down to listen for her breathing. Her eyes opened. There was no confusion in them, no slow waking. She came up out of unconsciousness like a woman who had learned to be alert before she was fully present, which told Elias more about her life than any introduction could have. She looked at him, and she did not ask who he was, or where she was, or how she had come to be lying in a stranger's field. She said, in broken English, barely above a whisper, "Don't let the scout in blue find me." What troubled Elias was not the fear in her voice. It was the certainty, as if the scout she feared was not merely hunting her, but knew exactly where her wounds would force her to run. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He was a man who had spent the better part of a decade avoiding situations that were not his business. He was good at that. He had made a life out of it. He picked her up anyway. And now the question that would haunt every hour that followed. Was Elias Voss riding toward the right thing for the first time in years? Or had he just picked up a trouble so deep it would pull him under before he ever saw the bottom of it? Elias Voss was not a man who moved quickly under the best of circumstances. But he got her inside before the sun climbed another hand-width over the eastern rim of the valley. He settled Naya Chatto in the oat room at the back of the barn, a low, attached storage space that shared one wall with the house and smelled of dry grain and old leather, where the thick walls still held the cool from the night before. He laid her on a folded canvas tarp, propped her head with a saddle blanket, and gave her water in careful sips from a tin cup. She drank without speaking. He changed the dressing on her side with strips of clean cloth, working quickly and without fuss, the way a man works when he has tended animals long enough to know that stillness and efficiency are their own kind of kindness. He had questions. He kept them to himself. That restraint may have saved her life, because the first answer came not from Naya, but from the sound of hooves crossing his yard. Not his horses, a group of riders, coming from the direction of Fort Bowie at a pace that meant purpose. Elias stepped to the window and looked out across the yard without moving the curtain. 4 men on horseback. One in front wore the bars of a lieutenant, young, straight-backed, with the kind of face that had never had to apologize for anything it wanted. Behind him rode 3 others, 2 in civilian clothes carrying rifles, and 1 in a U.S. Army scout uniform that was faded with trail dust and hard use. The scout sat his horse differently from the others, quieter, like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Elias went to the door and opened it before they could knock. The lieutenant introduced himself as Orrin Pike, out of Fort Bowie. His manner was polite, in the way that certain authority is always polite, covering iron with a thin coat of courtesy. He said there was an Apache woman who had absconded from a supervised area, stolen property belonging to the U.S. Army, and was believed to be attempting contact with unsanctioned Apache groups outside the San Carlos Reservation. He said it all in the flat, practiced tone of a man reciting something he had decided on before he left the fort. He asked permission to search the property. Elias scratched the back of his neck and squinted like a man who has been woken from a good sleep and is not yet fully reconciled to the world. He grumbled about his fence line being down, about losing half a morning to it, about whether the Army planned to compensate a man for the disruption to his working day. He let the complaints run long enough to sound genuine. All the while, he was watching the scout. The man had not dismounted with the others. He sat back slightly, eyes moving across the yard in a slow, professional sweep, reading the ground the way scouts are trained to read it. His gaze passed over the front steps and stopped. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second. Then Pike called him forward by name, telling him to pick up whatever sign he could find, and the scout swung down from his horse and walked toward the porch. His name, Pike had said, was Daho. Elias watched him cross the yard. There was something in the way the man moved, deliberate but tight, like a spring that had been wound one full turn past comfortable. Daho reached the base of the porch steps. He paused. He looked down at the ground near the bottom step, and Elias followed his gaze just long enough to see what he had seen. A small blue bead, no bigger than a huckleberry, lying in the dirt beside the step. The kind of bead used in Apache beadwork. The kind a woman might carry. Daho's boot came down on it without any change in his expression. He ground it slowly into the dirt, pressing it flush with the earth until it disappeared. Then he looked up at Pike and said the ground near the house was too hard and sunbaked to hold a track worth following. He recommended checking the creek bed to the south. It was the first lie Elias had ever seen a scout tell badly on purpose. Pike considered this, then nodded and turned toward the creek. Elias kept his face the same careful nothing it had been since the riders arrived. But in his chest, something shifted. He had watched men make decisions under pressure for most of his adult life, and he knew what one looked like. That had not been the hesitation of a tracker who lost a trail. That had been a man making a choice between two things, neither of which he could afford to want. The riders were gone within the quarter hour, Pike taking his civilian trackers south toward the creek, promising he would be back if the search turned up nothing useful. Elias went back inside. He found Naya sitting up against the wall of the oat room, pale but awake, her dark eyes steady in the shadow. He told her a scout named Daho had just buried a bead of hers under his boot heel and sent the lieutenant in the wrong direction. Something crossed her face that was not relief and not surprise. It was older and more complicated than either of those things. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened once. She said, very quietly, that Daho was her brother. And then she told Elias what it had cost him to do what he just did, because Lieutenant Pike held the survival of their entire family in the ledger of his favors and threats, and a scout who was seen protecting a fugitive would not be given the courtesy of a trial before someone made an example of him. Elias stood in the doorway of the oat room, listening, and the afternoon light came through the small high window and lay across the dirt floor between them, like something neither of them knew what to do with yet. Night came slowly to the Sulphur Springs Valley, the way it always did in summer, the sky holding on to its color long past the point when the heat had finally relented, going from white to gold to a deep bruised purple before it gave up the last of its light. Elias lit a single lamp in the oat room and set it on the floor between them, low enough that it would not show under the door gap if someone came riding into the yard uninvited. Naya was stronger now, not well, but present. She had eaten a little, drunk more water, and the color had come back into her face in the slow, grudging way that the body returns to itself after it has been pushed past what it thought it could survive. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and she watched Elias with eyes that gave away very little. He asked her what she had taken from Fort Bowie. She reached under the canvas tarp she had been lying on and pulled out a folded rectangle of oilcloth, the kind used to keep documents dry on long rides. She unwrapped it carefully, with the deliberateness of someone handling the only copy of something irreplaceable, and held out a small sheaf of pages, torn along one edge where they had been ripped from a bound ledger book. Elias took them and held them close to the lamp. At first, the pages looked harmless. That was the trick of paperwork. The worst crimes on the frontier often arrived wearing neat handwriting and clean margins. They were supply and payroll records. Dates, names, quantities, figures. The handwriting was neat and bureaucratic, the language dry as the valley itself. But the numbers told a story that the language was trying very hard not to tell. Ration allocations recorded as delivered that had never arrived at San Carlos. Pay amounts logged for Apache scouts that did not match what the scouts had actually received. And a series of notations in a different hand, smaller and cramped, along the margins of several pages. Initials and figures that pointed to a private contractor receiving goods and money that the official record claimed had gone elsewhere. It was the kind of document that could ruin a man, several men in fact, if it ever reached the right hands. Elias turned to the last page. He ran his finger down a column of contractor names. He stopped. He had seen that name before. He knew it the way you know a name that you have spent years trying to forget and never quite managed. A freighting contractor out of Tucson, the same man who had hired the supply train that Elias had guided through the territory 8 years earlier. The winter run that he had always told himself was just a job, just a contract, just one season's work that was none of his particular business. He had noticed things on that run. Shortages in the manifest that did not match what was loaded. Stops that were not on the official route. A quantity of goods that arrived at the fort on paper, but seemed to have taken a detour somewhere between there and San Carlos that no one was inclined to explain. Elias had noticed all of it, and he had kept his mouth closed, and he had taken his pay, and he had come home and put a new roof on the ranch house with the money, and told himself that a man could not carry the weight of every wrong he witnessed without going under. He set the pages down on the canvas between them. Naya was watching him. She had been watching him the whole time he was reading, and she had seen whatever had moved across his face while he looked at that name. Because she said nothing for a long moment after he set the pages down, just looked at him with those steady, unrevealing eyes. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet and without particular anger, which made it land harder than anger would have, that her father's name was in those pages too, that he had served as a scout for 3 seasons and died believing that the pay he had been promised would at least keep his family in rations long enough for his children to grow up with something resembling stability. That when he died, the money that was owed him was simply gone. absorbed into the same system of ledger entries and contractor agreements that made theft look like paperwork. She said that Daho had joined the Scouts because he saw no other path that kept their mother alive through another winter, and that Pike had seen that vulnerability the moment Daho signed his name, and had filed it away the way a careful man files away anything that might be useful later. Then she looked at Elias for a long moment and said that the men who signed their names to fraud were easy enough to identify. But the men who saw it happening and chose not to speak, they were harder to name, and harder still to hold to account, because their hands never touched anything directly. She said that silence, in her experience, left its own kind of body behind, just with cleaner hands than the rest. Elias did not say anything for a while after that. He was not an unintelligent man. He understood what she was telling him, and he understood why she was telling him. He also understood that she was not wrong, and that there was no version of this conversation in which he came out looking like someone who deserved to feel comfortable about the choices he had made 8 years ago in the cold outside Tucson. He picked up the pages again and folded them back into the oilcloth with the same care she had used when she handed them to him. What he felt in that moment was not guilt exactly, because guilt was something you could set down when it became inconvenient. What he felt was older and heavier than guilt. It was the specific weight of a man who has finally run out of distance between himself and something he has been keeping at arm's length for a very long time. He had not brought Naya Chatto in from the bleached grass that morning out of pure decency. He understood that now. Some part of him, the part that had been carrying that contractor's name around like a stone in a coat pocket for 8 years, had recognized an opportunity that a decent man would have called a second chance, and an honest man would have admitted he did not deserve it. He folded his hands on his knee and looked at the lamp flame and said nothing for a long time. Outside, somewhere past the dark fence line, a nighthawk called once and went quiet. If a story like this one stays with you, the kind where a man sits in the dark and finally sees himself clearly, then you already know what this channel is about. These are stories about ordinary people caught between what is easy and what is right. If that matters to you, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means these stories keep getting told. By then, the valley had gone quiet in the wrong way, as if every living thing outside the walls had decided to hold its breath. They came back at midnight. Elias heard them before he saw them. The soft, careful sound of horses being walked rather than ridden, which told him everything he needed to know about what kind of visit this was. A man who comes in daylight with authority makes noise. A man who comes in the dark, walking his horse, does not want to be announced. He was already moving by the time the first shape appeared at the edge of the yard. Pike had not brought a formal patrol. No formation, no flag, no bugle, no official show of force. He came with 2 civilian trackers, one young private Elias did not recognize, and Daho Chatto riding behind them in his faded scout coat. 5 men total, enough to do what needed doing, quietly, not enough to make it look like a proper military action. Elias understood the calculation immediately. If Pike brought this to Fort Bowie formally, the ledger pages became part of a record. Questions would be asked. Names in those margins would surface. The only way to make the problem disappear was to make it disappear without paperwork. And that meant tonight, out here, with no one watching. He went to the door and opened it before they knocked, which had the effect he intended. Pike paused on the porch steps, recalibrating. A man caught off guard reveals himself in small ways, in the extra half-second before the courtesy comes back into the voice, in the way the eyes move to the spaces behind you before they settle on your face. Pike said there had been additional information. He said it required a more thorough search of the property. He said it with the smooth, practiced reasonableness of a man who has learned that if you say unreasonable things in a reasonable tone, most people will go along with them long enough for it not to matter. Elias said he supposed that was fine. He walked them through the house slowly, grumbling about the hour, moving from room to room with the unhurried irritation of a man who has nothing to hide and resents being treated as though he might. He was buying time, and he knew that was all he was doing, and he knew it was not going to be enough. The tracker who found the oat room was the better of the two. a lean, weathered man with a cavalry mustache and eyes that moved over surfaces the way water moves over rock, finding the low points. He pushed the door open and held his lantern inside, and the light caught the dark stain on the corner of the burlap sacking where Naya had been lying. He said one word to Pike. Pike looked at Elias with an expression that had finally dropped all its courtesy. He called Daho forward. He told him to go in and bring the girl out. His voice had the flat, absolute quality of a man issuing an order he expects to be followed because the alternative has already been explained and does not require repeating. Daho stood in the doorway of the oat room and did not move. The room was dark beyond the lantern's reach, but Naya was in there, pressed into the far corner, and she said her brother's name in Apache. Not loudly, just his name, the way you say a name when you need someone to remember who they are before they do something they cannot take back. Pike drew his sidearm and placed the barrel against the back of Daho's shoulder and said that a scout who refused a direct order in the field could be shot for it, and that there would be no shortage of witnesses willing to confirm whatever version of events made the paperwork cleanest. Elias hit the private with the flat of the spade before the sentence was fully finished. He had picked it up from beside the door when he walked Pike through the house, carrying it with him the way a man carries a tool he might need, without drawing attention to it. He was not fast. He had never been fast. But he was heavy, and he was close, and he knew exactly where he was standing when he swung, which counted for more than speed in the dark interior of a working ranch at midnight. The private went down hard against the wall. Elias dropped the spade and put his full weight into the nearest tracker before the man could bring his rifle around, driving him backward through the oat room doorway into the wall of the corridor beyond, using his bulk the way a working animal uses it, not with elegance, but with an absolute commitment to forward momentum. He got his forearm under the man's chin and his shoulder into his sternum and kept pushing until something gave. Behind him, the pounding roar of horses suddenly filled the barn. Naya had cut the rope lines. 6 horses in a closed space at midnight make a chaos that is difficult to overstate. Hooves on packed dirt, bodies slamming into stall boards, a lantern going over onto the ground with a sound like a small bell, and a burst of yellow light that skittered across the floor and caught the edge of a hay bale before Elias stamped it down. The second tracker was screaming at the horses, trying to get clear of them, and in the confusion, Daho finally moved. He moved with the decisiveness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. He got the second tracker by the collar and drove his head into the water trough with a sound that ended the screaming. Then he turned to find his sister in the dark. Pike had taken a blow to the shoulder from a horse that had decided it preferred the outdoors. He was down on one knee near the barn door, breathing in short pulls, but he still had his pistol and he still had most of his composure, which made him more dangerous in that moment than either of his trackers had been. He came up with the gun and swept it toward Naya. His hand found the oilcloth bundle first. He grabbed it from her, tearing it open as he backed toward the door, and a portion of the ledger pages came away in his fist. He shoved them inside his coat. Then he struck a sulfur match against the barn door latch and tossed it into the dry hay along the south wall of the storage room. It was not a full fire at first, just a thin lick of flame, but the orange light began to grow immediately, eating upward through summer-dried grass with an enthusiasm that left no room for negotiation. He was on his horse and moving before the smoke reached the barn door. As he rode, he shouted back across the yard, his voice carrying clear in the night air, that Elias Voss had harbored an Apache fugitive and raised arms against soldiers of the United States Army, and that Fort Bowie would hear about it before sunrise. Elias dragged the burning hay clear of the storage wall, kicked dirt over the loose sparks, and made sure the flame had nowhere left to jump before he turned away from it. What remained burned itself down to nothing, not much in size, just the corner of the storage wall and a season's worth of dried grass that he could not afford to lose, but could not afford to spend time mourning either. He was breathing hard. His shoulder hurt where the tracker had got an elbow into it during the struggle. There was blood on his forearm that he was fairly sure was not his. He stood there in the fading orange light and understood, with the clarity that only comes when a man has run out of options, that the calculation of his life had changed entirely in the last 3 minutes. It was not just Naya who was being hunted now. it was all three of them. And Pike had taken enough of the ledger to know what remained was still dangerous, but not enough to know where Elias would try to carry it. Stay with this story a little longer, because what waits in those canyon shadows before sunrise will decide whether Elias Voss is still just a man running from his past, or finally a man willing to face it. They left before the smoke had fully cleared. Elias saddled 3 horses in the dark, working by feel and the last of the diminishing light, and they rode out of the yard heading west before the sky had begun to show any gray at its edges. Daho rode behind them, covering the trail. His left arm had taken a bad knock during the fight in the barn, and he held it close to his side when he rode, but he did not mention it and did not slow down, and Elias did not insult him by asking whether he needed to stop. Some men carry pain the way they carry everything else, quietly and without making it anyone else's business, and Daho was clearly one of them. They followed the dry wash south and then cut west along a limestone shelf where the rock was hard enough to hold no tracks worth reading. Elias knew this ground. He had ridden it in every season for 11 years, and he knew where the shelf ran long and where it broke off, and he knew the old Apache passage through the lower dragoons that most of the Fort Bowie patrols had either forgotten about or never learned to begin with. He led them through it in the dark, without hesitation, which was the one useful thing his years as a civilian packer had left him with, a memory for terrain that did not fade the way other memories did. They made a hidden camp in a narrow rock canyon an hour before sunrise, tucked back from the entrance behind a bend that would hide their fire and muffle their horses. Elias knew this place too. He had sheltered here once during a bad winter storm, years ago, when the pass had closed and he had nowhere else to go. The canyon smelled of mineral water and old ash. It was not comfortable, but it was invisible from the trail, and invisible was what they needed. Daho sat against the canyon wall and let Naya look at his arm in the gray pre-dawn light. She probed along the bone with her fingers, methodical and unsentimental, and when she was satisfied that nothing was broken, she tore a strip from the hem of her shirt and bound the arm tightly from elbow to wrist without asking his permission or waiting for his approval. Daho watched her do it with an expression that held more than a working man usually allows his face to show in company. When she finished, he said something to her in Apache, low and brief, and she did not respond, just tied off the binding and moved back to her place on the other side of the small fire. But she did not look away from him for a long time after that. Elias gave them jerked beef and water from his canteen and sat apart from them, watching the entrance to the canyon and thinking. The ledger pages that remained were still with Naya, the portion Pike had not managed to grab in the chaos of the barn. Enough, Elias judged, to be worth something to the right person. Maybe not enough to bring down the whole apparatus of fraud and silence that those margins described, but enough to open a door that someone with more standing than a heavy-set rancher and 2 Apache fugitives could push further. He turned it over in his mind while the fire burned low. Naya came and sat beside him after a while, not close, just near enough to speak quietly without waking Daho, who had finally allowed himself to sleep with his back against the rock and his hat pulled over his face. She held out the yellow bandana. He had forgotten he had given it to her. She had washed it somehow, he did not know when, wrung it out in the little seep of water that ran along the base of the canyon wall, and it was damp and clean in her hand. She reached across and tied it back around his neck without ceremony, the way you return something that belongs to someone, and you want them to understand it is being returned deliberately. She said that if he still wanted to do something that meant more than one night of not looking away, she knew what that something was. She said the pages needed to reach someone who could make them matter. Someone outside the military structure. Someone with legal standing and enough dislike for contractor corruption to take the risk of using what she was carrying. Elias told her he knew a lawyer in Tombstone, a man named Caffrey, who had made a career out of despising the kind of arrangements those ledger margins described, and who had the professional stubbornness of someone who had never learned when to leave something alone. He said he knew a route through the lower dragoons that would keep them off every road the Fort Bowie patrols used regularly. He said it without warmth or poetry, just stated it as a set of facts, the way a man states the things he has already decided. Naya looked at him for a moment and then looked away, back toward the canyon entrance where the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, going from black to a deep and tentative blue. Then she said that a man who knew the terrain and kept his mouth shut for 8 years would at least know how to move through it without being seen. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something more practical than either of those things, which suited Elias fine, because he had not asked for forgiveness and would not have known what to do with it if it had been offered. The light came slowly, the way it always came in that country, reluctantly, and then all at once, flooding the canyon walls with the particular gold of an Arizona summer morning, the kind of light that made everything look clean and temporary, and somehow both at the same time. For one brief minute, it almost felt as if the canyon might keep them. Almost. And then Elias saw it. A column of dust on the road below the canyon rim, moving from the direction of Fort Bowie at a pace that was not a patrol's easy walk. It was moving with the deliberate speed of men who know where they are going and have been told not to come back without what they went for. He counted the shapes at the base of the dust cloud and stopped counting at 6. Pike had not needed to ride all the way back to Fort Bowie. Somewhere along the Apache Pass Road, he had found the men he had kept waiting. And this time, he had not come to search a ranch house. He had come with enough men to do everything he had threatened, to hang a scout for treason, to burn what was left of a rancher's property and reputation, and to make sure that a torn sheaf of ledger pages never found its way to a lawyer in Tombstone or anywhere else. Elias reached back and woke Daho with one hand on his good shoulder. He said they needed to move. Naya was already standing. She had the oilcloth packet held against her chest with one hand, and with her other hand she reached out and took a light hold of the back of Elias Voss's coat, the way a person holds on to something when the ground is uncertain and they have decided for now to trust the person in front of them to know the way. He did not look back at her. He just started walking, leading his horse deeper into the canyon, into the shadow in the cool mineral air, toward a passage that Pike's men did not know existed, and that Elias had spent 11 years hoping he would never need to use for anything that mattered. He was using it now. Behind them, men with rifles were coming. Ahead of them, a lawyer in Tombstone might be their only chance. Between those two facts, there was nothing but rock, heat, and the old man's memory of hidden trails. Whether that was enough to balance against 8 years of chosen silence, Elias did not know. The Dragoon Mountains gave no answer. They just stood there, old and purple and patient, watching him lead Naya and Daho deeper into their shadow, while Pike's dust rose behind them.